Hi everyone, welcome. My little green board here is resting on top a couple of the bins that are listed on the board. The systems that you see out here in front of us, the two black tubs, are the ones that are showing here as the 189-day-old system fed 16 times. That's the one on the left, and the one over here on the right is the 154-day-old system fed 13 times. And for now 136 days, both systems have had a piece of cotton towel running in them, and the last time we checked in here, which was 11 days ago, we checked in on those and there was hardly anything remaining. There's one piece of strand, I think, of some sort of synthetic fiber to which there was a little bit of cotton material still clinging. After 11 days, it's quite possible that they would have already done away with that, leaving us only with that one piece of synthetic material which won't get composted and can be removed at that time. But we'll see how that's coming along. I even made a note here how the older system has a cork in it, a cork that's been floating around in my systems. I guess the mystery item here in the middle is the yellow bins that we even checked in on briefly when we fed these systems last time 11 days ago. We just went over there to peek in on them. Those systems have been now foraging for 31 days, for a whole month now. And 31 days ago was the last time we actually featured a video on those buckets. I thought maybe we would bring those buckets out here today too and just give them a quick little stir and check out this little note here with the asterisk. I did put a little bit of a melon treat in there. Even though those systems are technically foraging, I sort of gave them a little treat. Perhaps not a full formal feeding, but nonetheless I figured maybe that would make things interesting for our next check-in. Perhaps some worms coming up for that little melon rind treat. So I'm going to get these systems up on the bench. We're going to get them fed. Then we'll even take a quick look in on the buckets to see how they're coming along. So I'll put on a glove and we're going to get up on the bench. So let's get to work. You might be able to see the paper moving around a little bit over here. That's because I've got a fan blowing down onto the bench from above. The fan is helping me keep cool because it is a hot summer day, but I think that the main reason I would say that the fan is running here is because I've been using the fan to dry the contents of some of my really damp systems where things seem to have just gone a little bit out of control from a moisture perspective. Here, we took that extra step of trying to manage moisture last time, 11 days ago, by removing plastic coverings that had been on here and putting those paper coverings that we just removed. So here it felt like we didn't have to go to any sort of extreme measures by putting fans on here and stuff like that. It did seem to us like perhaps just by swapping out the plastic coverings to allow for a little bit more airflow, we would be in good enough shape to not have to worry about excess moisture buildup in these systems. So we'll see. Hopefully that is the case. Those paper coverings, as you saw, were pretty thoroughly draped out across the entire top of both systems, covering things quite thoroughly. So now I did try to position our little cotton composting test objects in such a way that it would make for easy retrieval next time. I've got these mango seeds, one in each system, on top of which the fabric had been positioned to help us zero in on its location more readily next time. So here you see the those little remnants of cotton that I was referring to earlier. It does seem to me like this could possibly be the only little tiny bit of fabric that still remains, cotton fabric that remains. The synthetic, I assume polyester of some sort or whatever material that's still surviving and showing very little signs of progress, will need to at some point just get removed because the worms won't be able to eat that stuff. So I guess we didn't really take a whole lot of time previously to see how the mango seeds themselves are doing. The threads themselves were the focal point, but the seed inside this husk is really getting worked down. The worms have pretty much ripped it to shreds and they're sort of inside the seed itself. Sometimes they just get into the husk, hang out inside the husk and work their way into the seed, but the seed eventually becomes their main interest, I believe. So now here again, it's a fairly long piece of thread, fairly easy to locate as long as I keep it near the seed. This one looks like it could very well be close to the finish line at this point. I'm not sure if this is just a little tiny piece of the cotton still stuck to it or something else. It does seem like a little bit of leftover cotton, a little bit of the towel, perhaps right there too, that tiny fragment. So I'm not in a rush to see it all gone. I think some people might even consider it as effectively being gone at this point, considering the advanced degree of decomposition that can be seen. In this mango seed, it does seem like the worms are a little bit slower on breaking it down. I could see springtails inside this seed too. So it does seem like the springtails have made themselves at home in this bin too. I have been noticing some springtail activity in a few of my bins, especially one of my bins where it's really kind of a springtail haven. But I do want to include a little bit of extra time here for us to be able to check in on the buckets too, so we're not going to dawdle too much. We're going to see about getting these little guys in here fed, move on to the buckets. I just figured I would really quick also try to recap a little bit why I consider these systems to sort of be interrelated. Because there was a certain point at time here in the older bin where I extracted the worms out of a system and launched off this bin here, and then I took the worms out of two systems and took all those worms and launched off a number of buckets. And then later I took the castings from all those systems and I left them to be a cocoon nursery. And when I finally rounded up the baby worms out of that cocoon nursery, those were the worms that I used to launch the younger of the bin right here. So that's how I see all these as sort of being somewhat interrelated. Mainly this one here being related to not only this bin, but the buckets as well. The tie between this one, the older system, and the buckets is not a whole lot. It's really more about this system being related to this and the buckets by way of the cocoon nurseries. It does seem like the main leftover that I encountered here while pouring through the feeding area was some leftover rind of cantaloupe melon. I think there might have been some banana peel put in here too, and some bedding material, and I think the bedding material is still holding out pretty good too. We saw a bunch of that too when I unearthed the contents of the feeding zone. And I've got a little bit more of that prepared bedding we could drop in beneath today's feeding. Let's continue with the extraction of the contents of this system's feeding zone 2. See how things are progressing, see what kind of leftovers we encounter. I'm not sure why, but for some reason I thought that the younger system, the one that was originated from the worms that came out of the cocoon nursery, I thought that this one was the system that I had launched with a estimated number of worms under 1,000. Something in the neighborhood of 925 sort of rings a bell. From when I was looking at my spreadsheet earlier where I keep track of all this information, I just wanted to mention that number briefly, because just from looking at all the worms hanging out down here in the feeding zone, it would appear that we've got a good sized population living in here, quite possibly in excess of 1,000 worms by now. That's kind of what you would expect after all this time, that the worms would be breeding and multiplying and increasing their numbers, and that's always a good thing to see. I'm just also at the same time, while I'm exploring what's down here, trying to gauge what I consider to be the moisture content or the moisture level, dampness level, how wet things are down here, to see if it's possibly getting a little bit out of control, or is this still manageable? It does feel quite damp, perhaps a little more damp than would normally be to my liking, but I think we're still okay. We're not quite at the point where a system would require us to blow a fan across the top of it and then come back every day or two to till up the material and stir in the dried materials off the top surface. So I think here we're still in pretty good shape. We're going to come in with some of my prepared bedding here, which is prepared with some dampness, but there's not a whole lot of it. It is dampened when I mix it all together but it's not all that damp. So some batches are a little bit more damp than others. This batch doesn't seem to be quite that damp. In another of my systems that I was a little bit worried about in terms of moisture levels, I did actually go to the just the shredded paper and cardboard mix, not the prepared bedding that I showed you a moment ago. I do have a bucket of only the shredded paper and cardboard, which is completely dry. No leaves, no moisture added to it. I was using that stuff in some of my other systems where it did feel to me like there was possibly a bit too much moisture. But here I think we're probably in pretty good shape. So I'm coming in now with stuff like, I believe a lot of this is radish leaves. And what you saw down there at the bottom over here was just the edge of a head of cabbage. Here's even more cabbage, just a leaf basically. And each system's also going to receive a banana peel. And there's other odds and ends down in here. We'll see about trying to divvy it all up pretty fairly. And then on top of the food, before we sprinkle in the coffee from those two coffee filters, ooh, look at that. The fan is blowing the it's blowing the crushed eggshell all over the place. And it's not even the eggshell, because I believe the eggshell itself just drops right down. It's that light membrane that's against the shell when you crack open an egg, and you sometimes see a thin membrane in there. I'm pretty sure that that's what we're seeing flying away, because I'll usually try to do away with that membrane material by taking my whole batch of crushed eggshells outside and taking a fan with me, and then dropping the entire batch of material down in front of the fan, so that hopefully just the eggshell drops down onto a piece of paper, and then the breeze blowing from the fan sends all that membrane lightweight material flying. But it does seem like this batch still has a good bit of that membrane material in it. So let's just set both feeding zone indicators off to the side, because that coffee filter right there is going to turn into our feeding zone indicator. I just figured I would take some of this excavated material that we pushed off onto both sides and pile it up on top of the feeding area to cover up. And then before we consider our work here done, I also like the idea of just quickly aerating the material out here on the outskirts of both systems. It does seem like the material down here low is also pretty damp. Hopefully by aerating it will allow it to possibly shed some of its excess moisture to evaporation. I mean, those paper coverings will go back on. They are pretty thoroughly covering things here. But since it is paper, I'm treating it as a porous material, which does have the ability to, you know, allow some moisture to escape. And if we had to, we could always just leave those pieces of paper off at some point in the near future to simply let the system dry even more. But for now, I think these systems are still young enough and have enough time to go before they're finished that we don't have to worry too much about the dampness levels. There's still good amounts of bedding material throughout both of these systems, all over the place. If it was a lot higher concentration of just castings only, that I think would make me a little bit more concerned that the stuff would begin to start clumping together due to the excess moisture. I mean, even over here, the stuff we're exploring does seem to have a pretty high degree of concentration. This is the somewhat older system, by maybe a month or so, and it does seem to have a somewhat more advanced degree of progress in terms of the ratio between the bedding materials in the bin and the castings mixed in between. This system actually does feel a little bit drier than the younger system, luckily. If it were just as damp as the other system, then I think that we'd be seeing a whole lot more clumping of this material. But it does seem to me like both systems are still quite in good shape. And I do believe that the removal of the plastic covers last time we were in here 11 days ago was the right move. Otherwise things would be possibly becoming a little bit out of control from a moisture perspective. So I'm putting the coffee filters down as indicators to show us where we last fed. You can tell just from looking here how much clumpier this stuff down here is due to the excess moisture. But I'm not going to react to what I think right now is a bit of excess moisture. We're just going to cover back up the way we found the systems, back on with these pieces of newspaper covering, pretty thorough newspaper covering. And if at some point we felt like things over in the younger bin were still a bit out of control as far as moisture, we could take other measures, but I think for now we're in good shape. So let's not forget, we want to spend a little time in the buckets. So I'm going to get those out here next. In there, we're not going to be feeding. In there, I'm just interested in aerating the material in the bins or in the buckets. So hopefully that'll go pretty quick. Let's move on to that next. Alright, so I've got these buckets lined up. Bucket number 1 is here in front of us. And like I said, I don't really intend to spend a whole lot of time here. I was just curious to see how one day's worth of progress on a couple of pieces of melon rind might look. Yeah, there's a cocoon right there on that melon rind. Right there, stuck to it. So we'll be sure not to let that drop to the floor and get lost. It looks like the juices from the melon rind. It was placed in here frozen, probably dripped down onto this paper, making the paper really interesting for the worms. And the one thing I found really interesting to me was just the presence of many, many little baby worms. You know, the whole idea of setting these buckets up in the first place was that they'd be breeder buckets with a fairly small number of worms, an estimated 250 worms placed into each bucket, given a fairly spacious amount of room relative to the population size, which is thought to be one possible way to trigger breeding in the worms. And I always felt like it was very hard to see any evidence of any breeding, but right there, I think in the first minute or so, we already saw the two most obvious bits of evidence, and that's the cocoon as well as the babies. So it does seem like, even though in the beginning I was a little bit, I don't know, feeling like things weren't really off to a good start from a breeding perspective, it does seem like these buckets did eventually kick in, and the breeding behavior in the worms has commenced to what we're interested in seeing. So my whole idea here was just to stir things up. 31 days ago, when these systems were formally fed the last time, they got pile of leaves dumped in down the middle, some coffee, some worm chow, and that was their last feeding. All stuff that I imagine has been gone for some time now. The that really big object that I removed also, something you probably recognized right away, but in case you didn't know what that was the stem of a pumpkin, which were just some novelty objects I figured I would run in these bins. So each system received a pumpkin. Bucket number 1 here received the largest of all the pumpkin stems. And we've just been observing how those gradually over time get broken down. So I really didn't intend to spend all that much time in these buckets. I just figured here in bucket number 1, perhaps we can spend a little bit extra time just elaborating on certain details about these systems in terms of their origin, their purpose, the way things have been running now for the past month, and then we can cover up the stuff here in bucket number 1 and move on to bringing over bucket number 2. Here again, we're going to find a couple little melon treats that we put in here yesterday for them, as well as a pumpkin stem, not quite as large as the one that's in bucket number 1. Bucket number 1 got by far the largest of all the pumpkin stems. And I think that I'm already sort of convinced that the worms really came out for the juices coming out of those melon rinds, perhaps not so much the melon rinds themselves. And here I'm already bumping into the stem. This is a pretty good sized stem too, but I believe as we work our way to the ongoing additional buckets, the stems got smaller and smaller in size, to the point where I think I started even placing 2 stems in, trying to compensate for the fact that bucket number 1 received just such a huge size pumpkin stem. It seemed realistic to give the other bins a secondary pumpkin stem. So this is also a pumpkin stem, but it's pretty heavily worn on the stem end. The butt end of it that connects to the pumpkin itself is holding out pretty good. That part of it seems to be a lot tougher. So let's just continue on here with the whole concept of just aerating the system, while at the same time just trying to get a sense for the foraging and how it's doing. How are they doing in terms of breaking down all the residual bits of bedding and stuff still lingering in these systems. I'm also trying to gauge if I like the moisture level, and I think I do. I think things are quite nice and comfortable down in these systems from a moisture perspective. The worms should be quite content to be in these buckets. I think it is basically the depth of the container that allows the material to stay quite damp, because it just sort of probably, I don't know, I'm just assuming that it sort of restricts airflow across the top, allowing for a great deal of the moisture just to remain down within the systems as opposed to just wafting away in the breeze. Not that there's a lot of breeze down here in my wormery, but still, I think there's sort of like a high humidity zone out here right above the material that enables the systems to just hang on to their moisture quite nicely, a lot better than the bus bins do. So we're on to bucket number 3. We presently have 4 buckets. I originally started out by launching 5 buckets, but then I had a friend of mine inquire about obtaining some worms from me. So I indulged his request and gave him some worms. So those were the worms that had lived in bucket number 5. And I actually thought that I had takers for the rest of these worms, but I've since found out that at least one of the people that were interested didn't really have all that much interest anymore, or maybe I just misunderstood originally what was discussed once upon a time. The other person still seems interested, but perhaps not quite as enthusiastic about it as they had been when they originally started asking about getting worms from me. So we'll see what happens with these. I was totally into, adopting these worms out to others, but if I need to keep them around and have them stay here with me and take care of stuff for me as far as composting, that's fine too. I've always got plenty of stuff that needs composting. Here we go. I was just rummaging around trying to find where the pumpkin stem was, or, well, there should be 2, right? I'm not going to go crazy looking for it. Maybe it's just shroud. Here it is. Pretty good size one. Look at that. Wonder why it was so hard for me to locate it. And then what you see down there is also another object that I forgot I had placed into all the systems. All the systems received either a grape stem or a tomato stem. And this might be a tomato stem. So let's make sure we drop all those sort of test objects back down beneath the surface of the material before we level off. I guess we'll keep the little bits of watermelon rind out here near the surface, but the pumpkin stems, I like the idea of them being down within the bed so that they can really continue to get worked on and stay kind of damp and soft to make it easy for the worms to keep nibbling on this stuff. So let's press on. We have but 1 bucket remaining to take care of, and that is bucket number 4 right here. Now I gotta say, the material there in bucket number 3 was really nice. Almost, I would say, nicer than what we saw in the others. Curious to see how things look in here. You might have also noticed that the first couple buckets still had some leftovers of the top covering newspaper that had been in all these systems. Somehow I just sort of lost track once what was going on with those top coverings in a couple of the buckets, and the paper sheets sort of just got blended in with the rest of the material and then subsequently just got gobbled up by the worms, because at that point the worms just saw it as sort of bedding materials and sort of like a food source, as opposed to it being sort of a top covering. Looks like I must have chipped off a chunk of this pumpkin stem. It's quite fragile at this point, but I do prefer to not help the breakdown process by chipping chunks of it away. If I do chip a chunk of it away, it's usually not intentional. Sometimes I do sort of probe into a pumpkin stem just out of curiosity, then I find myself chipping it off, and it's almost always, you know, an accidental action. And then here, this is one of those stems that hardly has any stem. They must have really cut the stem off quite close to the pumpkin itself. So the only portion of it that really seems to remain is the star-shaped piece that connects to the pumpkin itself. It's the toughest part, you know. The long stem end, the part that connects to the vine, seems to be much more capable of drawing moisture into itself and becoming fragile and broken down by the worms, versus the tougher base that connects to the vegetable. And here and there I just keep spotting cocoons, which is so cool, you know. I mean, I don't know if it's visible here on my thumb, and now it's on my index finger right in between the two. It's on my thumb now. Little cocoon. I do keep spotting them here and there, but I just haven't taken the time to really examine one up close. That one just seemed like it was staring me in the face. But we're pretty much done here. Let me get the those pumpkin stems back down where I want them, which is down within the bed. And then we can keep the little bits of watermelon rind out near the surface to possibly give the worms a reason to come up and hang out near the surface. Although, you know, our composting worms are generally surface feeding type worms, since the stuff that they're most interested in is decomposing material like leaves and other things that are usually out on the surface. So that's kind of the reason I thought that having the pumpkin treat for them there would be an ideal spot. So that's it now for our check-in with our, not only our 2 bus bins that we checked in the beginning, but now also our yellow breeder buckets. So I just thought that might be interesting for us to have sort of a all-in-one check-in with all the systems. But that's it. That's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up. Can you see my thumbs up? I'm trying to fit it down here in the bucket. Because that's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.